No woman ever lasted more than a night in that mansion. The resignations were always a spectacle of humiliation and despair, culminating in dragged suitcases, screams, and the sound of a door slamming shut. For the 4 children of the billionaire Harrison Cole, it was a delightful game. Every new nanny who crossed the imposing entrance hall was just the next piece to be knocked over on their board, and so far, victory had always been overwhelming and unanimous. That night was no exception. The 7th candidate in 3 months descended the stairs, her face distorted by crying, her uniform stained with paint, and her hair stuck with a sticky substance. "They are demons!" she shouted into the emptiness of the room, her voice choked with panic and fury. From the top of the staircase, 4 pairs of eyes watched the scene with a victorious gleam. Audrey, the eldest at 12, stood with her arms crossed and a disdainful smile on her lips. Paige, 10, bit her nails, but her eyes danced. With malice, Owen, at 8, could barely contain his laughter, while little Miles, at 6, clapped his hands, enchanted by the drama. "I told you," Owen whispered to his sister. "She wouldn't even last until dinner." The sound of the slamming door was followed by a satisfied silence. They had won once again. The fortress they had built around themselves remained impenetrable, protected by their childish cruelty and the pain that fueled it. Harrison Cole, watching everything from the shadows of his library, felt the glass of whiskey grow heavy in his hand. He was a titan in the business world, a man known for his coldness and his ability to crush the competition without blinking. He had built an empire of luxury hotels. His word was law in boardrooms across the world. Yet here, inside his own home, in front of his own children, he was a deposed king, a defeated general. With every nanny that fled, he saw not just one less employee, but a reflection of his own colossal failure. He could control fortunes, but he was completely unable to control the sadness that had turned to poison in his children's hearts. The anger, fueled by impotence, finally exploded. "Do you find this funny?" he roared, his voice echoing off the cold marble of the hall. The children's smiles faltered for a moment. "Do you think it's a game to ruin the life of every person I bring to take care of you? Do you think it's fun to act like little monsters?" His shout was an act of pure despair, the roar of a man watching his lineage disintegrate before his eyes. He wasn't just angry about the mess or the disrespect. He was terrified by the emptiness he saw behind their malice, a total absence of empathy he didn't know how to fix. Audrey, haughty and fearless as ever, took a step forward, her chin held high. "We don't need anyone," she replied, her voice as cold as ice, far older than her 12 years. "No one you bring understands us. No one is like Mom." The mention of their mother was like a knife plunged into Harrison's chest. The image of Amelia on her hospital bed, fragile, her voice a thread, returned with overwhelming force. He could feel the touch of her cold hand in his, could hear her last plea. That name, which was rarely spoken in that house, was the key to all the chaos, the origin of all the pain that now overflowed in the form of rebellion. He turned away, unable to face his daughter's accusing eyes. The promise he had made to his wife on her deathbed weighed on him like a mountain. "Protect them," she had asked. "Don't let them get lost." And yet, 3 years later, that was exactly what was happening. He watched them getting lost every day, drowning in their own pain and dragging everyone around them down. He had given them everything money could buy, the best toys, the most exotic trips, the most expensive schools. But he had failed to give them the one thing Amelia had asked for, the one thing that truly mattered, protection from themselves. The night was long and torturous. In his office, Harrison sifted through piles of resumes from the most exclusive agencies, each page a reminder of his previous failures. Child psychology experts, governesses with decades of experience, nannies with military training. None had been a match for the alliance of his 4 children. From upstairs, he could still hear their whispers and muffled laughter, the sound of their victory echoing like a mockery. Around 3 in the morning, he slammed his fist on the desk, frustration consuming him. "There has to be someone," he muttered to the darkness, "someone in the world capable of breaking this barrier." It was a prayer cast into the void, with no expectation of an answer. The next morning's breakfast was tense and silent. The children ate with a rehearsed indifference, as if the previous night hadn't happened. The sound of the doorbell broke the monotony. No one reacted. It was just the beginning of a new cycle, the arrival of the next victim. Harrison stood up, dragging himself to the door, prepared for another useless interview. But the voice he heard from the other side made him stop. "Good morning. I'm here for the nanny position." He opened the door, and the figure he saw left him completely speechless. The entire family, who had turned to look, fell into absolute silence. It was a woman, yes, but different from all the others. In the mansion's doorway, framed by the morning light, stood a woman with dark hair and a steady gaze. There was a serenity in her posture that was almost defiant in that charged environment. But what made time stop, what silenced the malicious laughter and froze the contempt on the children's faces, was the fact that she was not standing. She was seated in a wheelchair. Harrison blinked, certain he was seeing things. You're here for the position?" he managed to ask. She held his gaze, unwavering. "Yes, I heard no one lasts long here, but I didn't come to give up." The 4 siblings looked at each other, a cruel smile beginning to form. This was going to be easier than they thought. A woman in a wheelchair against 4 rebellious, wounded children. An impossible battle before it even begins. If you believe in the strength hidden where we least expect it, leave a like, subscribe to not miss a second of this story, and send a message of support to the courageous Isabel and the children she will try to save. The silence that followed Isabel's introduction was broken by Owen's cruel laughter. "How are you going to take care of us if you can't even walk?" he asked, his voice dripping with a childish contempt he had learned to use as a weapon. Miles, the youngest, mimicked his brother's laugh, while Paige hid a smile behind her glass of juice. Audrey, the silent leader of the small army, simply raised an eyebrow, the judgment clear on her face. For them, the battle was already won. This woman wasn't an adversary. She was a joke, a fragile figure they would break. For pure boredom before nightfall, proving once again that no one was strong enough to invade their world. Isabel didn't flinch or show any hurt. Instead, she pushed her chair forward, moving closer to the table until she could face each of them. "I don't need my legs to take care of you," she said, her voice surprisingly calm and firm, cutting through the mocking air. "What I need is patience, firmness, and something you all seem to have forgotten." She paused, her gaze moving from one face to another. "I am not afraid of you." The declaration was so direct, so devoid of hesitation, that the laughter died. They expected tears, anger, or pleas. They did not expect a challenge. Harrison, still stunned, felt the need to intervene, more out of a sense of duty than conviction. "Ma'am, with all due respect, my children, they are complicated," he began, the words sounding weak even to himself. "The last nanny left last night in tears. I wouldn't want you to go through a situation." He was offering her a way out, a chance to retreat before the cruelty of his children reached her. Deep down, he wasn't trying to protect her, but himself, from the spectacle of yet another defeat, another proof that his family was irreparably broken and that he was powerless to fix it. She interrupted him with a gentle gesture of her hand, a movement that didn't ask but assumed control. "Mr. Cole, I didn't come here for you to feel sorry for me," she said, now addressing him but without taking her eyes off the children. "I came because I know what it's like to live in a house where pain disguises itself as anger. I know what happens when there are no boundaries." Her words carried a weight, a wisdom that seemed to come from deep wounds. If you're looking for someone to just put up with your children, perhaps I'm not right. But if you're looking for someone who understands them and won't give up on them, then I am the right person for this job. Owen, upset with the loss of control, decided to move from verbal provocation to action. He deliberately let his silver fork fall to the floor, the clatter of metal on marble echoing through the room. "If you're so brave, pick it up," he challenged, a malicious smile forming on his lips. The other siblings held their breath, complicit in the act. It was the perfect test. Humiliating, physical, and in their view, impossible for her. They imagined her asking for help, dragging herself on the floor, or simply admitting defeat. It was the checkmate that would give them victory in the very first round of this silent war. Isabel observed the fork on the floor for a second, then looked at Owen without any expression. She said nothing. With an agility no one expected, she maneuvered her chair, leaned slightly, and using her foot pinned the fork against the wheel. With a fluid, surprising movement, she lifted her foot, bringing the utensil up, caught it in the air with her hand, and placed it gently on the table, right in front of the astonished boy. The silence in the room was absolute. The children stared at her as if she had performed a magic trick. She had turned their trap into a demonstration of her unique strength. Paige, trying to regain power for her brother, was the first to break the silence. "It was just a game," she muttered, but without her earlier conviction. Isabel turned her face to her, her gaze still calm but incisive. "A game is when everyone has fun, Paige. Do you think it was fun for me?" The question wasn't a scolding, it was a lesson in empathy, something clearly lacking in that house. Paige didn't know what to say. For the first time, someone hadn't reacted to their attack, but had deconstructed it, forcing them to look at their own cruelty, and that was more uncomfortable than any shout or punishment. Audrey, the silent leader, felt she had to intervene to reassert dominance. "Don't think that just because you picked up a fork, you're going to last here," she said, her voice cold and defiant. "They all leave, and you will too." It was the group's final sentence, a promise that until then had always been kept. They were the masters of this territory, and she was just another invader, destined to be expelled. The threat hung in the air, a final effort to intimidate her, to remind her that, in the end, they always won. She was one, and they were four. The math, for them, was simple. Isabel met Audrey's gaze and held it. "That will depend on you," she replied, her voice without a hint of hesitation. "Because, unlike the others, I don't run, I don't flee." The sentence, spoken with absolute conviction, made even the haughty Audrey avert her gaze for a fraction of a second. And it was in that instant that Harrison made his decision. "All right," he said, breaking the silence. "The position is yours." He hired her not out of pity or desperation, but because he had just witnessed something he hadn't seen in years in that house. Someone who was not afraid of his children, and more importantly, someone who was not afraid of herself. The mansion plunged into its usual nightly silence after dinner. Harrison locked himself in his office, a safe haven of book-lined walls and family problems he didn't know how to solve. The children retreated to their rooms, or at least pretended to, and Isabel, after leaving the kitchen in perfect order, maneuvered her chair down the main hallway, feeling the electricity in the air. She had worked with difficult children before, but there was something different here. The four siblings weren't just rebels. They were an organized, calculating army, united by a shared pain that manifested as strategic cruelty. She wasn't just a nanny, she was a target. She turned off the hallway lights and went to her room. It was a simple room, almost monastic, compared to the rest of the house. She had barely parked her chair beside the bed when she heard the first sign, a soft creak in the hallway, followed by muffled laughter. Isabel smiled to herself. "Let the games begin," she whispered. The footsteps multiplied, and then a heavy, metallic sound was dragged and propped against her door. She turned the handle. It was blocked, Harrison's children had barricaded her door. It was a childish tactic, but symbolic. They wanted to cage her, isolate her, show who was really in control of that house. On the other side, the whispered voices of Owen and Paige were clear. Do you think she'll scream? Definitely. And tomorrow she'll leave, just like all the others. Isabel simply turned off her room light and waited in silence. The lack of a panicked reaction clearly confused them. After 10 minutes of silence, the attack escalated. She heard something being pushed, and then a liquid began to seep under the door. Water. They were trying to flood her room, a prank that could become dangerous. She took a deep breath, not with fear, but with the realization of the depth of these children's neglect. With a swift move, she took a towel from the bathroom and placed it firmly against the crack of the door, staunching the flow of water. Then she knocked gently on the wood. "Is that all you've got?" she asked in a loud, clear voice. The calmness in her tone more provocative than any scream. There was a shocked silence on the other side, followed by a nervous murmur. They did not expect such serenity. A few moments later, she heard hasty footsteps and a door slamming. They had not given up. They had just retreated to prepare the next phase of the attack, frustrated that they hadn't gotten the reaction they so desperately wanted. Half an hour later, the light in her room began to flicker intermittently, plunging the room into flashes of light and darkness. Then a final click, and the darkness became total. They had cut the power to her room. Isabel rolled to the window and opened it, the cold night air entering like a visitor. From the dark garden below, childish voices began to chant a cruel chorus. "Witch! Witch in a wheelchair!" they shouted, their laughter echoing. It was the lowest blow, aimed directly at her disability, the weapon they believed to be the most lethal. They wanted to break her spirit, to humiliate her until she surrendered. Isabel, however, instead of shrinking, breathed in the cold air and settled in her chair, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. Then she responded, her firm voice projecting into the night, surprisingly serene. "If you think darkness and shouting can scare me, you are very mistaken. I was born in darkness. I have lived in places much colder than this garden." She paused, letting her words echo. "And if you truly believe I'm a witch, then perhaps you are the ones who should be afraid of me." A sudden, total silence fell over the garden, followed by the sound of children running back inside the house, genuinely disturbed. The next morning, the 4 siblings came down to breakfast expecting to find a defeated woman, perhaps with her bags packed by the door. Instead, they found Isabel in the kitchen, an apron over her clothes, the scent of fresh coffee in the air. She was sitting at the table, reading a book, as if the previous night had been perfectly normal. "Good morning," she said, looking up and giving them a calm smile. "That was a good try last night. Creative. But you'll have to try much harder if your intention is for me to leave." They stood paralyzed, the food untouched on their plates. No one ever had validated their battles or spoken to them that way. The conflict continued in the garden. Owen and Miles turned on the hose, aiming a jet of cold water directly at her. Isabel, instead of retreating or screaming, spun her chair with the precision of a dancer, letting herself get soaked, and then smiled. "Thank you, boys. I really needed to cool off in this heat." Their attack was neutralized, turned into a favor. They looked at her, completely disarmed, not knowing how to react to this absence of victimhood. She didn't give them the drama they sought, the chaos they used to feel in control. She simply absorbed their attacks and rendered them harmless. Meanwhile, Audrey and Paige were preparing a more elaborate trap. A rope stretched between 2 trees at the exact height to catch the wheels of her chair. They then called her over, pointing to a path that would lead her straight into the snare. Isabel looked in the direction they pointed, then at their faces, and a small smile formed on her lips. She, who had spent years learning to read the world without relying only on her eyes, was an expert at detecting subtle dangers. The tension in the girls' posture, the way their gazes darted to the rope, everything was a clear signal. "Nice plan," she said, to the girl's shock, but a little obvious. Instead of following the indicated path, she went around the other side of the lawn, leaving the rope stretched uselessly behind. Next time, try to coordinate. Better. Surprise is the key to any good strategy. She wasn't just defending herself, she was teaching them, turning their war into a lesson. The four siblings gathered, frustrated. For the first time in a long time, their united army couldn't find a single breach in the enemy's defense. She was unshakable, unpredictable, and worst of all, she seemed to be enjoying herself. At noon, she gathered them in the kitchen. "Today, we are going to cook together," she announced. It was an invitation to chaos, and they accepted. Owen put too much salt in the soup. Paige hid the cutlery. Miles dropped eggshells into the batter bowl. Each one carried out their small act of sabotage, awaiting the explosion of anger. But it never came. With each mistake, Isabel offered a lesson. The soup is salty. Great, it reminds us that life isn't always sweet. No cutlery. Perfect, we'll learn to improvise. She transformed every act of malice into a metaphor for resilience, disarming them with a patience that bordered on the supernatural. By evening, the children were exhausted. They had used their entire arsenal of cruelty, and nothing had worked. She didn't break. She didn't even waver. Before going up to bed, Paige, the most skeptical after Audrey, approached Isabel. "You're not like the others," she whispered, the sentence a mixture of accusation and admiration. Isabel just smiled and gently touched her shoulder. "No, dear, and you are not like other children either. You just need someone to finally notice that." The girl ran upstairs, but for the first time, there was a crack in the armor. Isabel knew she had won the first and most difficult battle. Harrison spent the next few days immersed in his work, a refuge of logic and control. However, something was different. He found himself checking his phone, not for stock market news, but for the call that never came, the one from his housekeeper, announcing that the new nanny had fled in tears. The silence from home was more unsettling than the usual chaos. The absence of crises was an anomaly that his mind, accustomed to predicting and neutralizing problems, could not process. What was happening in his own house that he, the master of his universe, did not know? The lack of news was news in itself, and it left him deeply uneasy. The curiosity, mixed with a strange feeling that he was losing control, became unbearable. One afternoon, in an impulsive act that shocked his staff, he cancelled all his meetings and drove home. The drive was filled with a somber apprehension. He imagined the worst-case scenarios: an accident, blackmail, or perhaps the discovery that his children had finally committed an act so terrible that the household staff was afraid to tell him. He braced himself for the catastrophe, for the confirmation that his family was beyond repair, that his failure as a father was, in fact, absolute and irretrievable. As he parked his car on the gravel driveway, he heard it. It wasn't screams, nor crying. It was laughter, genuine, loud, and full of life, seeming to come from the heart of the mansion. The sound was so out of place in that environment of chronic sadness that for a moment he thought he was hallucinating. His heart quickened, but not with panic, but with a deep confusion. That was not the cruel laughter of one celebrating a victory over an adult. It was the pure sound of childish joy, a melody he thought he would never hear again within those walls. He entered the house. Like a thief, following the sound, trying to understand the source of this impossible miracle. He found them in the grand salon. They had built a fort with sheets and chairs and were putting on an impromptu play. Isabel narrated a story with dramatic gestures, and his children, his 4 rebellious children, were the actors. Paige, always so cynical, brandished a wooden spoon like a knight's sword. Owen and Miles were fierce dragons, roaring and rolling on the carpet. And even Audrey, his defiant eldest, held up a lamp to simulate the sun, a small smile on her face. They were not a combat unit. They were a theater troupe, completely immersed in a world of pure imagination and collaboration. Harrison remained in the shadows, an unseen spectator of his own family's happiness. A sharp pang gripped his chest, a complex and painful emotion. It was admiration for what Isabel had accomplished, but it was also a sharp, bitter jealousy. How did she do it? How did this woman, a stranger, in the wheelchair, unlock the joy that he, their father, with all his money and power, had failed to find in 3 years? He realized with crushing clarity that his wealth had only built them a beautiful prison. She, with nothing but patience and imagination, was teaching them how to be free inside. He understood then that the childish tests, the locked doors and hoses, were not enough. He needed to see if her magic worked outside the bubble of the mansion. He needed to drag her into his world, a world of appearances, strict rules, and cruel judgments. He wanted to expose her, perhaps to prove to himself that what she was doing was an illusion, something that would not withstand the scrutiny of the real world. If she failed in public, he could rationalize his own failure, could tell himself that the problem was, after all, with his children and not with him. That evening during dinner, the atmosphere was noticeably lighter, until Harrison shattered it with a sudden announcement. "Tomorrow night, all 4 of you will accompany me to a business event at the club." The silence was immediate. Forks stopped in midair. The club was, for the children, the ultimate symbol of their father's boring and restrictive life. It was a perfectly set stage for disaster, a place where spontaneity was punished and appearances were everything. They understood the hidden message in those words. This was not an invitation. "Dad, that's not a good idea," Owen said in a low voice, a rare display of genuine concern. The siblings exchanged nervous glances. They knew their father wasn't inviting them for a family night out. He was taking his private war with Isabel to a new, more dangerous battlefield, one where she would be at a complete disadvantage, where the rules were dictated by him and his social circle. He wanted to see her fail, wanted to expose her supposed inadequacy in front of everyone. This was a trap, and they, the children, were the bait. Harrison silenced him with a look and turned to Isabel, the true recipient of the order. "The club has a very strict dress code and code of conduct. There will be important people. Do you think you can control them in such an environment?" The question was a direct challenge, a glove thrown down on the table. He expected her to back down, to make excuses, to show fear. Instead, Isabel met his gaze, her face a mask of serenity. "Yes," she replied, her voice clear and without hesitation. "I do." Her calm acceptance threw him completely off balance. He had set a trap, and she had just walked right into it willingly. The next day was a battle of wills. Paige refused to wear her chosen dress. Owen and Miles waged a war against their ties. But Isabel did not yell. She did not threaten. She talked, reasoned, and convinced them. To Paige, "Your mother would be proud to see how strong and elegant you look in this dress." To the boys, "A gentleman doesn't wear a tie because he has to, but to show respect. Tonight we will show everyone what the Cole family is really made of." She transformed the dreaded event into a mission, a chance for them to present themselves to the world not as problems, but as a team. They arrived at the club, a sanctuary of crystal chandeliers and whispered conversations. As the Cole family entered, a trail of murmurs followed them. The sight of Harrison's notorious children, usually a harbinger of chaos, walking in calm discipline alongside a woman in a wheelchair was a spectacle no one expected. The whispers were a mixture of pity, curiosity, and a cruel anticipation of the imminent disaster. Everyone was waiting for the explosion. Harrison felt the familiar sting of public judgment, but this time, he was the one who had lit the fuse. A business associate approached, a smug smile on his face. "Harrison, I see you've brought reinforcements. A very special nanny." The word "special" was said with a pause laden with mockery. The neighboring table laughed. Harrison waited, almost wishing for Isabel to crumble. Instead, she smiled. "You're right, sir," she said, her voice clear and audible. "I'm especially good at ensuring these wonderful children aren't tempted to set fire to the curtains, like the last time they were here." A stunned silence was followed by a burst of genuine laughter. Harrison stared at her, bewildered. She had not only deflected the attack, she had used it to win over the room. The main course was served, and, with it, the inevitable tide of boredom that always preceded the children's storms of misbehavior. But this time, Isabel was prepared. She leaned in and whispered a new challenge: the spies' dinner. The mission was simple. Each of them had to discreetly observe the adults at the neighboring tables and later report one interesting, unspoken detail they noticed, something no one else would see. The task transformed the stuffy dinner into an intelligence mission. Instantly, the four siblings became secret agents, their eyes sharp, their chaotic energy channeled into a game of perception and silence. The club owner, an old acquaintance of Harrison's, approached the table with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Harrison, good to see the children behaving," he said, the pause heavy with meaning. "Although I must admit, this isn't the usual environment for the staff." Before Harrison could respond with his usual sarcasm, Isabel spoke, her voice calm but clear. "Perhaps that's the problem, sir. These children need to learn that the world is bigger than the walls of this mansion. My job isn't just to watch them, but to teach them that kindness and respect are worth more than a club membership." It was then that the accident, the moment everyone had secretly been waiting for, happened. Miles, the youngest, while reaching for a bread roll, knocked over a full glass of red wine. The dark liquid spread across the pristine white tablecloth like an open wound. A collective gasp rippled through the nearby tables. This was the disaster, the public shame, the proof that chaos was inevitable. Harrison felt his face burn, anger and humiliation bubbling up inside him. He braced himself for the scandal, for the pitying looks, and for the confirmation of his failure as a father. Isabel, however, showed no panic. She looked at Miles's terrified face and gave him a reassuring wink. She took a clean napkin, folded it to a point, and instead of scrubbing the stain, she began to press it gently, guiding the spreading wine. "Look," she whispered to the children. "It's not a disaster. It's a dragon." The other siblings leaned in, fascinated, as she transformed the red stain into a curious, abstract shape. The accident under her hands ceased to be a mistake and became an act of creation, a moment of unexpected magic. The surrounding guests, who had leaned in expecting shouts and drama, fell silent, captivated by the scene. "What an incredible woman," a lady whispered to her husband. She turned an embarrassment into a moment of pure art. The club owner, who was watching from a distance, approached again, this time with an expression of genuine respect. Isabel's ability to turn chaos into beauty under pressure was a form of power that few in that room, including Harrison, were familiar with. She didn't just control the situation, she recreated it, making it her own. Harrison remained seated, in a stunned silence. Every trap he had anticipated, every point of failure he had imagined, she had navigated with an impossible grace. She hadn't just controlled his children, she had charmed his peers and disarmed his critics. He had brought her here to expose her, to prove she didn't belong in his world. Instead, she had held up a mirror to his world and exposed its pettiness. He felt a confusing mixture of anger at his own miscalculation and a reluctant, profound admiration. At the end of the night, as they prepared to leave, Isabel maneuvered her chair beside him. "You wanted proof, Mr. Cole," she said, her voice low so only he could hear. "But you were testing the wrong thing." He looked at her, confused. The problem was never their ability to behave. The problem is that they need someone to truly love them, not just someone to control them. The words, spoken without anger, were like a blade, a simple, devastating truth that pierced all his defenses. That night, sleep was impossible for Harrison. He paced the floor of his dark library, replaying the evening's events. The image of his children defending Isabel, the way she handled the spilled wine, and above all, her final words. He, the man who controlled an empire, felt completely outmaneuvered by his children's nanny. Who was this woman? This calm, unbreakable force who saw through him and his world with such clarity. His plan to expose her had backfired spectacularly. It had only served to deepen the mystery surrounding her. Driven by a desperate need to regain control, to understand the source of her power, he made a decision. He sat at his desk, the one place where he felt truly in command, and opened his laptop. He contacted his trusted private investigator, a man who had solved many problems for him over the years. "I need a full report on a woman," he typed. "Isabel, the new nanny. I want to know everything. Her past, her family, her medical history. Absolutely everything." He sent the message, feeling a strange knot in his stomach. He wasn't just investigating an employee. He was trying to solve the puzzle that was threatening to unravel his entire world. The next morning, the dynamic at breakfast had shifted. The children were not rebellious. They were calm, respectful, and looked to Isabel for guidance. They excitedly recounted their favorite parts of the mission at the club, proud of how they had behaved as a team. Harrison watched them, the investigator's report pending, feeling like a stranger at his own table. He had intended the dinner to be Isabel's downfall, but instead it had become her coronation in the eyes of his children. The authority in the house had subtly but definitively changed hands. As he was preparing to leave for work, Paige approached him. "Dad," she said quietly, "last night, for the first time, I wasn't ashamed to be part of our family." The simple, honest confession hit Harrison harder than any business failure. He had been so focused on his family's public image of power that he never realized his own children were ashamed of their behavior, of their unhappiness, of the chaos that defined them. He now understood that Isabel wasn't just teaching them manners, she was giving them back their dignity. Harrison went to his office that day, but he couldn't concentrate. He was waiting for the report that would either confirm his suspicions that Isabel was a brilliant imposter or reveal a truth about her past that might be even more unsettling. Questions haunted him. Who is the woman who is healing my children? What pain has forged such unbreakable strength? And why does he feel a terrifying sense that the answers, whatever they are, will change him forever? The seed of a profound transformation, born from a failed test, had been firmly planted. Isabel won the battle, but the war for the truth is just beginning. Harrison is now searching for answers in her past. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the revelation, and comment. Have you ever judged someone and later realized you were completely wrong about them? The investigator's preliminary report arrived the next day, a short and enigmatic email. It stated that for the past 4 years, Isabel seemed to have disappeared from formal records. There were no employment contracts, no social security contributions. It was as if, to the system, she did not professionally exist. Harrison's suspicion, the cynical and distrustful part of him, flared up. Was she a con artist? After all, someone living on the fringes, perhaps taking advantage of rich, vulnerable families. The doubt he had hoped to resolve only deepened, becoming darker and more dangerous to the fragile peace beginning to settle in his home. Later that day, while wrestling with these suspicions, he went down to the kitchen and stopped, observing a scene that contradicted all his dark theories. Isabel was teaching his children to bake cookies. The kitchen, normally a space of military order, was covered in a thin layer of flour. Miles was laughing as he tried to crack an egg, and Paige, with surprising concentration, was shaping the dough. Isabel guided them all with infinite patience, her face also smudged with flour, her wheelchair positioned in the center of the happy chaos. The image was of a domesticity so pure and genuine that it directly conflicted with the poison of suspicion in his mind. That evening, the dissonance deepened. He stood outside the children's bedroom, hidden in the shadows, and listened to her tell a bedtime story. It was not a traditional fairy tale. It was the story of a princess who, after an accident, lost the ability to walk, but discovered she could fly in her dreams and see the world's beauty through the hearts of those who loved her. Isabel's voice was soft, but laden with a melancholy so authentic it felt as if she wasn't reading from a book, but from her own soul. Harrison felt a tightness in his chest, a feeling that this story was much more than simple fiction. When she came out of the room and found him in the hallway, Isabel was startled. "Have you been listening for long?" she asked. "Long enough," he replied, his voice grave. "You speak as if you know that princess's pain." Isabel looked at him, and for the first time he saw a deep vulnerability through her serenity. "We all have our battles, Mr. Cole. Some are visible, others are not." She gave no further explanation, just moved away down the silent hallway, leaving him with the feeling that he had touched an old and sacred wound, one he had no right to understand. The final call from the investigator came late at night when the mansion was in absolute silence. "Sir, I found the reason for her professional gap," the man on the other end of the line said. 4 years ago, Isabel was in a very serious car accident. That's when she lost the use of her legs. The information landed on Harrison like a stone, explaining the obvious, but at the same time, explaining nothing. The wheelchair was not the heart of the mystery, it was just a fact. The real question, the one that haunted him, was about the strength she possessed, the serenity that seemed to come from a place he couldn't reach. The investigator paused as if hesitant to continue. "Sir, there's one more thing. She wasn't alone in the car." Harrison held his breath. Her 4-year-old son was with her in the back seat. The silence on the line was broken by the investigator's low, heavy voice. "The boy didn't survive." The sentence, short and brutal, hit Harrison with the force of an explosion. The air left his lungs. The office seemed to spin. A son. She had a son she lost, the same age as his youngest children. The truth was infinitely more tragic than any lie he could have imagined. Suddenly, everything clicked into place with a painful clarity. Her infinite patience with his children's cruelty, her ability to absorb their anger without breaking. The story about the princess. The sadness in her eyes he had mistaken for weakness. It wasn't a nanny's strategy, it was the instinct of a grieving mother whose immense love had been left homeless and who now found a new purpose, a new reason to exist in another man's children. Her connection with them wasn't a plan, it was a need of her wounded soul. Harrison hung up the phone, the receiver slipping from his trembling hand. A wave of shame, so intense it made him nauseous, washed over him. He had judged her, tested her, investigated her, suspected her, while she was silently carrying a grief that he, in his privileged life, could not even begin to comprehend. He felt small, futile, a man rich in possessions but miserable in perception. Her strength didn't come from a dark secret, but from the purest and most unimaginable resilience. She wasn't an imposter, she was a survivor. For the first time since Amelia's death, Harrison Cole wept. Not a controlled cry of mourning, but deep, convulsive sobs that shook his entire body. He cried for the son she lost, for the unimaginable pain she endured every day with a serene smile. He cried for his own arrogance, for his emotional blindness. He cried because, for the first time, he understood that the woman he had hired to care for his children was, in every sense, infinitely stronger than he would ever be. The revelation didn't just solve the mystery, it broke him. The next morning, Harrison was a different man. The arrogance was gone from his posture, replaced by a quiet, profound respect. He watched Isabel interact with the children, but now he saw every gesture through a new lens. Every patient smile was a victory over pain. Every kind word was an act of courage. He no longer saw the nanny in a wheelchair. He saw a queen on her throne, ruling a small kingdom of wounded children with a wisdom born from the deepest suffering. He found her in the garden later as she helped Miles plant a small flower. He approached, and for the first time, he didn't know what to say. He couldn't mention the report, couldn't verbalize the tragedy he now knew. So he simply said the only words that mattered. "Isabel, I'm sorry." His voice was thick with emotion. "For my doubts, for my distrust, for everything." He didn't need to say more. She looked up at him, and in his eyes, she saw that he knew. She understood that he had finally seen her. Isabel didn't respond with words. A silent understanding passed between them. A single tear, which she didn't bother to hide, rolled down her cheek, but she smiled through it. It was a smile of relief, of acknowledgement, of a shared pain that could finally be seen without being named. The wall of secrets and suspicions that had separated them had finally crumbled, not with the noise of a confession, but with the silence of a newfound empathy. There was no longer an employer and an employee, just two souls who had known loss. That conversation, almost wordless, was the true beginning of everything. The dynamic between them transformed. He was no longer the skeptical boss, and she was no longer the employee under suspicion. They were two people united by a revealed tragedy and a shared purpose, the happiness of 4 children. The foundation of their relationship shifted from a work contract to a pact of mutual respect and deep understanding. Harrison finally understood that to heal his family, he first had to learn to see the pain and strength in others. And the most important lesson of his life was being taught by the woman he had almost driven away. The day after the revelation dawned with a grey sky, mirroring the whirlwind of emotions in the Cole mansion. Harrison no longer saw Isabel as an employee, but as an enigma of strength and pain. He began to observe her in a different way, no longer with the suspicion of an employer, but with the curiosity of a man discovering a new continent. He noticed the small things, the way she tilted her head when listening to the children's stories, the way her hands, though delicate, were firm and sure in guiding them. He saw the sadness that sometimes veiled her eyes when she thought she was alone, and the light that filled them when one of his children achieved a new feat. He began to come home earlier, using work excuses that not even he believed. The truth was that the mansion, once a place he fled, had become the center of his universe. He wanted to be there to witness the small daily miracles. He watched hidden as Isabel taught Owen to tie his shoes, a task that required infinite patience. He listened as she helped Paige with her homework, explaining theorems with surprising clarity. He realized her intelligence was not just emotional, it was vast and multifaceted, imprisoned by a lack of opportunity. The admiration he felt began to transform into something warmer and more dangerous. He found himself comparing her authenticity to the artificiality of the women in his social circle, women who spoke of charity at lavish parties but looked down on their staff. Isabel didn't speak of kindness. She practiced it silently, every day. She wore no masks. The pain and strength in her face were real. This raw honesty attracted him in a way that scared him. He, the man who had always been most comfortable with the predictable, was falling in love with the unpredictable. One afternoon, as they were walking in the garden, the wheel of Isabel's chair got stuck on a protruding root. Before she could maneuver to free it, Harrison stepped forward and, with a care that surprised him, began to push the chair. "I don't need help, Mr. Cole," she said, her voice firm as always, but with a touch of embarrassment. "I know," he replied, his voice low, not looking at her. "But maybe I need to help." It was the first time he admitted his own need, his own desire to care for her. That small gesture, the sound of the wheels on the gravel under his command, changed the dynamic between them forever. The fragile bubble of peace they were beginning to build was burst on a Tuesday afternoon with the unexpected arrival of Victoria. Elegant, blonde, and with the self-confidence of someone born into wealth, she was the woman everyone in Harrison's circle expected to become the new Mrs. Cole. She entered the mansion unannounced, as if the house were already hers, and found Harrison and the children laughing with Isabel in the living room. Victoria's smile froze, and her eyes moved. From Harrison to Isabel, with a cold, instant calculation. She didn't see a nanny, she saw a rival. "Harrison, darling, what a lovely scene. Teaching the children to be charitable to the less fortunate," Victoria said, her voice sweet as honey, but the words dripping with venom. She approached, completely ignoring Isabel, and knelt in front of the children. "But don't you think it's time you had someone who can run with you in the garden?" The question was a direct and cruel attack, designed to expose Isabel's physical limitation as a flaw in her care. The children, however, didn't laugh. They shrank back, sensing the malice behind the fake sympathy. Later, Victoria found Isabel alone in the library. "Listen closely," she hissed, abandoning all pretense. "I don't know what game you're playing, but it ends today. Harrison might be going through a charity phase, but he would never look at someone like you. You're a pastime, a curiosity. Know your place before I have to put you in it myself." The threat was clear, the war declared. Isabel faced her, the calmness on her face being the most infuriating response she could give. "My place, madam, is where these children need me. And from what I can see, they need me a great deal." Harrison didn't hear the conversation, but he saw the change in the house's atmosphere. He saw the frightened look in the children's eyes and the shadow that hung over Isabel, despite her efforts to smile. That night, he confronted Victoria. "What did you say to her?" At first she denied it, but under Harrison's cold, inquisitive gaze, she admitted it. "I just told her the truth, darling. She's taking advantage of your vulnerability." The tranquility with which she uttered the slander chilled Harrison's blood. He finally saw the ugliness behind her beauty, the cruelty behind her elegance. He no longer felt attraction, only a deep disgust. He asked Victoria to leave and, for the first time, walked her to the door, a final, unequivocal gesture that she was no longer welcome. Then he looked for Isabel. He found her in the children's room, reading a story, her voice soft, but with an almost imperceptible tremor. He waited until the children were asleep and approached her in the hallway. "I'm sorry for what Victoria said," he began. Isabel just nodded. "I need you to know," he continued, his voice filled with a new urgency, "that what she thinks, what the entire world thinks, no longer matters to me." He then did. Something he had been putting off, something the investigation couldn't give him. He asked her to tell her story, not as an interrogation, but as a friend. "I don't want any more secrets between us, Isabel. I want to know you, the woman, not just the nanny. I want to understand the pain you carry with such courage." The request, made with genuine vulnerability, broke down her final barrier. And then, in the silence of the mansion's hallway, she began to speak, her voice low, telling of the love, the accident, and the loss that had defined her life. As she spoke, he didn't interrupt. He just listened, absorbing the enormity of her tragedy and her resilience. He finally understood that her strength wasn't about not feeling pain, but about choosing to transform that pain into love every day. When she finished, tears were streaming freely down both their faces. He didn't offer cliches or words of comfort. He just reached out and touched her face, a gesture of deep respect and admiration. In that moment of confession and empathy, their relationship transformed, moving from gratitude to something much more profound and significant. The next day, Harrison made his final decision. He gathered the children and Isabel in the living room. "I had a conversation with Victoria yesterday," he began, "and I want you all to know that she, and anyone who does not treat Isabel with the respect she deserves, is no longer a part of our lives." The children looked at him, Surprised and relieved, Isabel is not just a nanny. She is the person who is teaching us how to be a family again. And from today on, she is officially part of this family. Anyone who cannot accept that does not need to walk through that door. The declaration was a decree. It was Harrison drawing a line in the sand, choosing his new improvised family over the expectations of his world. Audrey, the eldest, who had watched everything in silence, approached and for the first time hugged her. "Father, thank you," she whispered. In that hug, Harrison felt the confirmation that he was on the right path. He had spent years trying to protect his children from the world, but now he understood that the best protection was to build a world within his own home, a world based on love, respect, and the courage to accept people as they truly are. Harrison's transformation was noticed by everyone. He began to delegate more at work, to come home at reasonable hours, to actively participate in the improvised therapy sessions in the garden. He rediscovered the joy of simply being a father, of listening to his children's stories, of participating in their lives. The mansion, once a stopping point between one workday and the next, became his true refuge. He was no longer fleeing the pain that those walls represented. He was filling them with new memories, new laughter, a new life. Isabel, in turn, blossomed. Free from Harrison's distrust and protected from external attacks, she allowed herself to be more than just the nanny. She became Audrey's confidant, Owen's playmate, Miles's storyteller, and Paige's mentor. And with Harrison, she found a friend, a partner on a healing journey they both desperately needed. The wheelchair became just a detail, an accessory, overshadowed by the immensity of her presence in everyone's life. One evening, as they watched the moon from the terrace after the children had finally fallen asleep, Harrison turned to her. "You once told me I needed to learn to see with my heart," he said. "I think I'm starting to learn, and the first thing I see clearly is you." The declaration was not an explosion of passion, but a calm, deep realization. He was no longer falling in love with a mystery. He was in love with the woman he finally knew, with all her scars and all her strength. Isabel smiled, a genuine smile that lit up the night. "I see you too, Harrison. For the first time, I see the man behind the billionaire." The attraction that had grown between them, previously suppressed by secrets and hierarchies, could now finally breathe. There were no more barriers. They were just two people who had found in each other the missing piece to mend their broken hearts. Two souls who discovered that true family is not the one we are born into, but the one we build from the ruins of our losses. The high society's reaction to the new dynamic in the Cole mansion was a mixture of shock and whispered gossip. Victoria's expulsion from Harrison's inner circle was the main topic at dinners and charity events for weeks. Many saw Isabel's influence as a successful manipulation, the story of an opportunist who took advantage of a rich widower's fragility. What they couldn't see, and perhaps never would, was the profound, silent revolution happening within those walls, a change that had nothing to do with money or status. Harrison, who once would have cared about every rumor, now ignored them with an indifference that surprised everyone. His priority was no longer his public image, but the stability of his home. He and Isabel faced the external judgment as a team. When an old friend made a sarcastic comment, Harrison would respond with an icy calm, defending Isabel's integrity without hesitation. He became the protector he had promised to be for his children, and he extended that protection to the woman who had saved them. Every rumor they faced together only strengthened the bond between them. The most notable transformation, however, was in the children. Feeling safe and loved, their rebelliousness dissolved, giving way to cooperation and affection. Audrey, once so hard and cynical, became Isabel's protector, reprimanding any schoolmate who dared to make a malicious comment. Paige discovered a talent for painting, expressing in colors the emotions she once kept locked away. Owen and Miles, once partners in chaos, were now partners in creative adventures, building fantastical worlds in the garden. Without the need to destroy anything to feel seen or heard, the house, once a battlefield, became a sanctuary of healing. Isabel's therapy sessions continued, but now with Harrison's active participation. He learned the exercises, invented new games, and marveled at his children's resilience. He was reconnecting with them in a way he thought was impossible, discovering the unique personalities of each, their dreams, their fears. He was finally paying the debt of time and attention he had, accumulated for years, and with each passing day, he felt the weight of guilt lessen, replaced by a simple, profound joy. On a rainy afternoon, they were all gathered in the library. Isabel was reading a book aloud, and the four children, along with Harrison, were sitting on the floor, nestled in cushions, listening intently. In that moment, looking at his children's faces, at the serenity on Isabel's face, Harrison understood the final truth, the promise he had made to Amelia on her deathbed: protect them, don't let them get lost. He was finally fulfilling, and the person who taught him how to do it was not an expensive psychologist or a self-help guru, but a woman who, despite having lost everything, never forgot how to love. That night, after the children were asleep, Harrison and Isabel sat on the terrace under the starry sky. The silence between them was no longer one of suspicion or hierarchy, but of deep comfort. He didn't make a grand speech or a formal marriage proposal. Instead, he turned to her and said, his voice calm and sincere, "I can no longer imagine this house or my life without you in it." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, an admission of a truth that had become as natural as breathing. Isabel didn't respond with words. She simply reached out her hand and placed it on his, a simple gesture that held all the acceptance, all the mutual feeling. Their commitment was sealed there, not with a ring, but with a silent understanding. The news was communicated to the children the next day, not through an announcement, but through gestures. They saw their father's hand resting on Isabel's during breakfast. They saw the new, easy complicity between the two. Their reaction was not of surprise, but of a simple, happy acceptance. It was just the formalization of a truth their hearts already knew. Audrey gave a rare, genuine smile. Owen made a joke about finally having someone to keep their father in line, and the twins celebrated, relieved. The war in their house had finally ended, and peace had Isabel's face. The stable, loving parental structure they had craved was finally complete. A year later, the Cole mansion was unrecognizable, not in its structure, but in its soul. It was no longer a silent museum, but a vibrant, sometimes chaotic home full of life. Audrey, the cynical general, had transformed into a confident young woman and a protector of her siblings. The once bare walls now displayed pages, colorful paintings. Owen's energy was channeled into sports, and Miles was a happy, sociable boy. They were not cured of their grief, as the loss of a mother is never cured. Instead, they learned to transform their pain into strength, guided by a woman who knew that path by heart and a father who had finally learned to walk beside them. On the anniversary of Amelia's death, the family instituted a new ritual. Instead of allowing Harrison to retreat into his grief alone, they all went to the cemetery. Together, including Isabel. She didn't try to take Amelia's place. She helped the children honor her memory. Each of them told a favorite story about their mother, laughing at the funny memories, crying for the loss. It was a moment of shared mourning, but it wasn't a sad moment. It was a beautiful healing ritual, an act that acknowledged the wound of loss but celebrated the new extraordinary family that had grown from the ashes of that tragedy, stronger and more united than ever. One afternoon, while they were all in the garden, Paige showed Harrison a drawing she had made of the mansion. "Dad," she said thoughtfully, "before this was your house. Now it's our home." The simple distinction struck Harrison with profound force. The sentence perfectly encapsulated their entire journey. A house is a structure, a container of wealth and loneliness. A home is a place of belonging, of acceptance, of shared laughter and comforted pain. He realized that Isabel's greatest achievement was not just saving his children from their rebellion, it was giving all of them, including himself, a true home. That evening, Harrison was in his library, but he wasn't looking at reports. He was looking at Page's drawing, now in a frame on his desk. He thought of the man he had been, powerful, lonely, and deeply unhappy. He measured his life by the value of his stocks. Now he measured it in other terms, in the sound of his children's laughter, in the warmth of Isabel's hand, in the feeling of peace that had finally settled in his heart. He finally understood that he had made the greatest deal of his life. He had traded an immeasurable fortune for the priceless wealth of a family, a love, and a home. The story of the Cole family became a quiet testament to the fact that healing often comes from the most unexpected places. It showed that true strength lies not in never falling, but in finding the courage to love again, even after a great loss. They learned that a family is not defined by blood ties or social conventions, but by the daily choice to show up for each other, to forgive, and to build something new on the ruins of the past. A woman who had lost her own family taught a man who was losing his that a home is not built with marble and money, but with patience, empathy, and a love brave enough not to be afraid of feeling. A story that teaches us that the greatest transformations come from the heart. What did you think of the journey of Harrison and his family? Leave your opinion in the comments, give a like if you were moved by this ending, and subscribe so you don't miss our new daily stories. Tomorrow's might be the one you need to hear most.